Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to this, which is our fourth webinar in the series of webinar following the launch of the Local Authority Scorecard and Guide, Addressing Modern Slavery. We worked with the Mekong Club and Stop the Traffic to produce these resources. And it's an online scorecard and supporting guide that allows local authorities and other public bodies to assess your modern slavery risks across your operations. Today's webinar will focus on one aspect of the guide, which is the procurement protocols, supplier engagement, and audit processes. Next slide, please. So today's webinar is going to cover off a brief overview of the scorecard and guide, and it will introduce the themes, and then we'll be followed by our speaker, Natalie Evans, who's Responsible Procurement Manager at Westminster Council. Natalie specialises in sustainable, responsible procurement and believes that working with supply chains is fundamental to achieving our UN Sustainable Development Goals. Natalie worked as Sustainable Procurement Manager at the Local Governments for Sustainability in Freiburg, Germany, where she ran the EU Public Procurement Help Desk, writing guides and case studies on addressing environmental and human rights issues through procurement. During her time there, she wrote 2 reports, Verifying Social Responsibility in Supply Chains and Success Stories in Socially Responsible Procurement. Natalie then went to work as a responsible procurement manager at the City of London Corporation until 2021. And she led on the strategic and operational lead on responsible procurement, incorporating social value, environmental sustainability, and modern slavery considerations into tenders and leading large-scale projects and pilots. And her current role is Responsible Procurement Manager at Westminster City Council. Natalie has worked on translating the UN SDGs and Fairer Westminster Strategy into strategic and operational outcomes in procurement, commissioning, and supply chain management. And she's written the guides on responsible procurement and commissioning strategy, and also the Westminster Council's Modern Slavery Statement 2021. So we couldn't have a more expert person to speak with us and share her presentation later on this afternoon. And following that, at the end of the session, there'll be time for questions and answers from you all. If any of your questions in the question and answer box rather than the chat box, I'll answer both. Thank you. Next slide, please. So for those of you that haven't heard of the self-assessment scorecard and guide, it's actually split into 2 elements. It's made up of an online scorecard, which takes you through a series of questions which allow you to assess how you're addressing your modern slavery risk. The scorecard is made up of 12 main questions with a number of sub-questions. What happens is that the scores are tiered, and the accompanying guide will correlate to the developing, if you're at a developing level, an advancing stage, or a leading stage in addressing your modern slavery risk. The scores are, if you're between 0 and 175 points, you're developing and the start of your journey. Advancing is 176 to 300 points, and leading is 301 points to 400 points. To get the most out of the resource, we recommend that you actually look at the guide first, understand what information and data you need to be collected, what teams you need to be engaged with before actually doing the scorecard. And we also see this very much as an internal tool to help you understand where you are and also how you can engage with other teams. And then also year on year, maybe you use it as a benchmarking process and go back to see how you're developing in the future. Next slide, please. As mentioned, the guidance should be read alongside the scorecard. It's a long resource, and obviously we don't expect you to read it from cover to cover. It's actually made up in 3 sections. The first, and it covers the 8 themes, which are modern slavery statements and policies, internal awareness and training, having a modern slavery lead or a single point of contact in your organisation, risk assessments, procurement policies and audit protocol and supplier engagement, audit protocols, reporting and remediation, and wider modern slavery coordination. The first section of the guide actually provides the context of the project alongside instructions of how to use it and the scorecard. The second part of the guide is actually the main bulk of it, and that's the guide that contains all the tiered guidance depending on whether you're developing leading organisation, and also next steps. So it gives some really practical examples and signposts to resources that could be used. And then in the final section, in the annexes, that's where you find a list of questions which are in the scorecard, and also some more useful information surrounding the resource. So as I previously mentioned, next slide, please, sorry. As I previously mentioned, we explore 8 different themes in this guide, and this webinar is going to look more closely at themes 5 and 6, which are procurement protocols and supplier engagement, and we'll briefly touch on audit protocols as well. Next slide, please. So the first 3 pages of the section on procurement protocols and engagement provides an overview of the protocols and the section of an instruction section of the guide. I think it really brings out the importance of actually starting a conversation with about modern slavery with your suppliers, as this may be the first time that they've heard of the terminology or first time they've had this conversation. How to incorporate modern slavery statements in writing, for example, in your tenders and contracts, and actually then working to build the knowledge of your suppliers through training and resources. And lastly, there's a focus in this section on working towards conducting audits. Next slide, please. This section is then followed by the 3 tables separating out into the development, advancing and leading stages of your organisation, depending on your scorecard results. The developing table focuses on engaging with your suppliers by starting initial and possibly informal conversations with them on their commitment to modern slavery. The advancing table takes it a step further by supporting your suppliers to begin making modern slavery statement commitments of their own, which are then enforced through procurement clauses and/or contracts. The advancing table also introduces the requirement to build the knowledge of your suppliers, for example, through training, signposting to training, or offering resources. The real gem of this resource is actually in the plethora of resources which can support procurement teams to work towards best practice. And then the final table is the leading table, where we looked at what key elements makes you a leading organisation from a procurement protocol and supplier engagement perspective. And we actually landed on these 4 elements. So supplier engagement, where you require tier 1 suppliers to have modern slavery statements and policies and uphold the same standards with their suppliers. The procurement clauses, the commitment is fundamental condition of tender contracting processes. And then the third element was training and support. So building the knowledge capital of your suppliers specific to language, industry and context. And finally, the 4th pillar was conducting audits to ensure compliance. Next slide, please. And then the section of the audit protocols, which is in the guide that we'll touch on briefly in today's session, is the need to actually have a clear audit programme to assess suppliers, engaging with your suppliers' employees as part of that process, and where audits have taken place, using the results of that audit to inform other processes such as your ongoing risk assessments and the cycle of auditing your suppliers. As is the case with every other theme, there are developing, advancing and leading tables for this section too. Next slide, please. So the final table is the leading table, and we looked at the key elements again, which would mean that you are a leading organisation from an audit perspective. These elements include the audit process with questions on modern slavery, the ability to actually measure the compliance, engaging with suppliers, employees, making sure that the audit process complies with international standards. So your supply chains may go across multiple territories, and considering also lower auditing tiers, so going beyond tier 1 to tier 2, tier 3. And then also looking at how our audit results incorporated into ongoing processes. So again, going back to the guide, this explains the different pillars and the different sections that we've identified that are leading. But in each level, there are really great resources to look at to see how you can actually develop on your journey to address modern slavery risks. Next slide, please. So we're absolutely delighted to have Natalie with us today. Thank you so much, Natalie, for agreeing to share your expertise and wisdom on this subject. And I'd like to hand over to you. Thank you so much.
Hello there, folks. Just going to share my presentation. It says host has disabled participant screen sharing. I'm not sure. I'm afraid I'm not massively familiar with Zoom. How would I share my presentation without sharing my screen?
I think if I make you co-host, it should be okay.
Ah, there we go. Thank you. Is that working?
Yep, all good.
Amazing. Okay, so thanks very much for having me along today. I wanted to talk a little bit about where modern slavery fits into responsible procurement and commissioning in general at Westminster City Council, but really do a bit of a deep dive with those present today on how we're actually getting this done in practice, specifically looking into procurement protocols and supplier engagement. We're not as far ahead in terms of our audit journey, but I'll go through that with you. So as my introduction says, I work for Westminster City Council as the responsible procurement manager within our procurement and commissioning service. Excitingly, my role actually ends today in the policy and governance team, and I'm moving over to the supplier relationship management side of procurement on Monday. I think this really shows the kind of evolution of responsible procurement once you've got a dedicated resource within your procurement teams to look at aspects, including modern slavery, but also things like social value, carbon reduction, etc. I think once you get strategies, policies, etc. in place and embedded, it's a kind of natural progression then that you're able to roll your sleeves up and work much more closely with your supply chain. And that will become evident over time as you mature in your organizations. Okay, so I'm going to kick off by just running through our new responsible procurement strategies objectives. I won't go through these in detail, but I wanted to kind of set the context for this. So we have a new Fair Westminster strategy. That's kind of the council strategy, which everything gets pinned to. Obviously, this isn't just a direct flow from that strategy. We in procurement helped inform what should be in that strategy as well. Before we became involved in procurement, it was a very local kind of agenda. And we kind of emphasized the fact that we have global supply chains within procurement. Procurement of any local authority will have global supply chains, and therefore our impacts and risks and opportunities can also be global in nature too. So that's now reflected in that strategy. So in terms of the first pillar, it's all about fairer communities. So this is looking much more locally at things like social value, tackling acute community need, things like food pantries, energy vouchers, things to tackle the cost of living crisis, right through to longer term social value aspirations, including community cohesion, tackling gangs, culture, etc., and antisocial behaviour, digital inclusion, things like that, and also diversity and inclusion, which of course is a subject that interlinks with modern slavery and human trafficking, where discrimination is practiced both in this country and abroad according to ethnicity and certain vulnerabilities. So moving on to our second pillar is fairer economy. So this very much focuses on employment and skills, but also looking at target businesses within our local area. Both employment of our residents, but also trying to improve the well-being of workers that are currently in our supply chains. I think often public authorities can really focus on increasing opportunities, employment skills and training opportunities for their residents, but they sometimes forget about supply chain workers that are existing. So we want to make sure that we're really pushing for fair pay, professional development opportunities, etc., for existing staff as well. Fair environment covers a wide range of areas, including carbon reduction, nature and biodiversity, air quality, waste and circular economy, but I'm not going to go into detail on that today. The one that we're really focusing on here is Objective 10, about increasing the due diligence to combat modern slavery and exploitation. We don't make statements like we have zero tolerance on modern slavery, etc. We acknowledge as an organisation that, of course, there must be modern slavery and exploitation happening within our supply chains, whether it be domestic or global. What our job is to try and identify where that's happening through some of the mechanisms I'll take you through today, and make sure that we are minimising that risk as much as possible and tackling issues where we find them. But it's not about avoiding the issue. I think the more that you look into your supply chains, the more you're going to find these issues. The rest of the pillar covers other aspects of our suppliers treating their suppliers, their own suppliers responsibly, and their supply chain workers, and also sustainable procurement further down the supply chain, things like sustainable sourcing of timber, soy, palm oil, things like that. Okay, so what is our new approach to responsible procurement and commissioning? So in new competed tenders, we are integrating responsible procurement into each and every stage of the procurement process. So, historically, and for those organisations that are just starting their journey, they tend to look at responsible procurement within their award criteria. Many councils give a kind of 5% weighting to responsible procurement, or sometimes social value within tenders, but what we're trying to do is create a wholesale integration of responsible procurement at each and every stage depicted here, right from contract review of existing contracts all the way through to contract execution and contract management. We do tailor our approach according to each contract, so we don't have a cut and paste blanket approach. We look at the highest risks and highest opportunities within each tender. So there are certain criteria we'll use if it's a very high carbon intensity contract, or other criteria we'll use if it's within a particularly high risk sector in terms of modern slavery. So we also want to look at the context of each sector. We don't just want to look at what we want to get out of these contracts, but also we need to acknowledge that there are particular priorities or contexts that our suppliers work in, whether or not it be difficulties in recruiting and retaining staff or supply chain issues. So we try and factor that in as well when we're tailoring. I think an issue that many of you will come across in terms of trying to get responsible procurement embedded into tenders, into procurement processes, if you're part of a procurement team, is that many of your stakeholders will want to direct award to a specific company, either because there's very little competition on the market, because it would risk the service if they swapped, and they just need a kind of a supplier to hold that place until they manage to go back out to tender. Obviously, it's sometimes it's poor planning in terms of timing, but it doesn't mean just because it's a direct award or a contract extension, it doesn't mean that you can that you have to forget about responsible procurement considerations. So what we've decided to do is, with all direct awards extensions and variations, we're including our new supplier charter and our ethical procurement policy, and it's a condition of contract as to whether or not the suppliers accept those new additions. And in existing contracts, we're doing a lot to try and encourage existing suppliers to take on our new requirements. We had a launch event last Tuesday to launch the new charter, and we had around 70 of our existing suppliers and many of them signed up voluntarily on the day to our new charter and ethical procurement policy, which was wonderful. And it means that we have a sort of certain amount of consistency of what kind of data we're requiring from our suppliers, levels of compliance and sort of interaction with us. So a lot of it does kind of depend on existing relationships, whether or not they've been well established over time. But we've kind of got a good working relationship with many of our suppliers. So we're pleased that they've voluntarily signed up to this. Okay, so first of all, I wanted to take you through our approaches to both new contracts and existing contracts in terms of modern slavery. So you'll see here, I'll go through these individually now in more detail, but just to give you a bit of an idea of the flow. For all new contracts, what we do as part of our procurement strategy phase, or the very early stages when we know that the project is coming to us, we do a sector-based risk assessment, partly part of market testing. When we're developing our procurement strategy, we look at the sector. So we're not just worried about particular risks in terms of recruitment, in terms of whether they use agency workers, in terms of particularly lower skilled work, those kind of things. We're also looking at the type of materials they're going to be procuring on our behalf. We've got particular concerns at the moment with AMPR equipment, with clean tech such as solar panels and electric vehicles. We're really focusing our efforts now on our net zero carbon targets. But we want to make sure that we're not creating an additional issue while trying to tackle another. So we want to make sure that as far as we possibly can, we are sourcing responsibly where it comes to that clean tech. We're then, in terms of new contracts, looking at integrating modern slavery and exploitation due diligence requirements within specs, or within service specifications, or within the scopes of works. We find that this is the most robust way of tackling it. It communicates to suppliers from the very outset that this is actually part of the contract. It's not a nice to have, it's not something peripheral. We put specific milestones within our service specifications for high-risk contracts on what they have to do when throughout the contract period and what we're working towards together. Now, this isn't something that we put in a contract and just let and forget, as the term goes. It's a partnership relationship that we have with those high-risk, high-spend suppliers. We give them milestones, but we support them every quarter on how they might do better. One particular example of that in my previous role is that we had an organization that was not doing very well on some of their responsible procurement commitments. They'd reached various barriers to delivering those commitments. So in order for them to get their contract extension, which was worth a lot to them, we asked them to undertake a supply chain mapping exercise of our laptops, our Lenovo laptops. But they'd never done a supply chain mapping exercise before. So we actually partnered them up with our supplier Marshalls. Many of you will have seen the good work that Marshalls do. You should definitely have a look on their website, the Quarry company, the natural paving, natural stone company. And they, as part of their kind of social value offer, trained the IT service provider into how to do a supply chain mapping exercise. So it kind of shows both that there is remit within an existing contract to do more, but also using those relationships you currently have to kind of share knowledge, etc., even across sectors. In terms of the supply charter, I'm going to go through that in a little bit more detail in a second, but we are asking all new contractors to make that commitment as part of supply selection. There are certain discretionary criteria we use. We use our rights under the technical and professional abilities aspect of the SQ. That obviously means that we have to tailor it. It has to be project specific, and we're only using it for high risk tenders. But if suppliers do not want to commit to meeting our modern slavery requirements as part of the charter, then they do not progress through to tender. So we're quite robust on that in terms of supplier selection. We then look at the modern slavery statement of the contractor before award, and we give them feedback on whether or not we think it's, there's gaps or that there's certain quality. We can't and don't particularly wish to at this stage kick suppliers out because of poor quality statements. That's not something we'd be allowed to do under the current regs anyway. But we assess statements by way of a conversation starter and by way of sort of baselining where they're at, you know, what particular gaps we can see. They may be doing more than they've written down. They may be doing less than they're stating, but it's by way of getting a snapshot of their particular levels of progress in each of the areas, including policy, training, due diligence procedures, etc. We engage with the suppliers as soon as the contract mobilizes to make sure that they're giving us a point of contact that we can work with on modern slavery issues. Sometimes this is their people in their risk department, sometimes they're in their HR department due to the fact that it relates to recruitment as well as procurement. And sometimes there's a few different contacts, including those in procurement, but it's really important to make sure that we set the kind of tone right from the beginning of the contract to make sure that they understand this isn't something we've just put in the contract and we're not going to look into later. So it starts us all off on the right footing. Once the contract's actually started, we then do a detailed contract specific risk assessment. This is often built into the specification. As I said in the first place, we set milestones of what we want. This includes hotspotting, supply chain mapping to see areas of particular risk in terms of geographical risk about where supply chain materials are coming from, and identifying the kind of top 5 most risky areas in terms of their supply chain, and then from there start looking into it in more detail about whether or not those companies have transparent information about factory audits, for example, through SEDEX, or whether or not they've undertaken the modern slavery assessment tool set out by the government. There's many different ways we can look at due diligence that's carried out on those very high risk materials. Developing action plans, the main onus is on the supplier, but as I said, we will support them with that if they're struggling, if they haven't got specific resources in-house, and then just keep monitoring and assessing them continuously. The kind of journey is never over, it's never just done in terms of modern slavery and exploitation due diligence. It's ever evolving and we can always do more on it. So on the right hand side, this is for our existing contracts. Just because they're already let and they've already signed up to previous requirements, it doesn't mean that we can't work with them. It's obviously easier if you have good relationships with them, but often the person that you're going to be working with on this isn't the same person, isn't your account manager. So even if the relationships aren't ideal, sometimes you can still get decent engagement with the person that is responsible for this within their organization. So again, we undertake a high level risk assessment. So we've identified 33 contracts that are the highest risk, highest spend within our organization that we have the resources to be able to look at. We then again do a modern slavery statement assessment. So we look in a qualitative way and a quantitative way of the quality of their statement, so that we have that conversation starter that I spoke of before. We always go through our contract managers because we want to obviously maintain good relationships with them, but start setting up meetings with our suppliers to run through what our findings of the modern slavery assessment. I'll take you through how we do that scoring shortly. And then we've asked our suppliers to voluntarily commit to our supplier charter, and we've got a number that have now signed up to that, representing hundreds of millions of pounds worth of our spend, which is great. And we carry out the very same thing as we do then with our new suppliers. Once we've got them to actually agree to working with us, undertake that detailed contract specific risk assessment, looking at the highest risk materials or areas of the particular service, works or goods that they're providing us, and develop those action plans and continuously improve. So they are quite similar approaches, but obviously sometimes undertaken in a slightly different order. It is obviously a lot easier if you get it into contracts in the first place, but just because those requirements aren't in there doesn't mean that you can't push existing suppliers. And the vast majority of people on the call are going to be including requirements to have a modern slavery statement within SQs. Obviously, we've now got the new modern slavery PPN where that's really been ramped up within SQs. So you can always use that. Hopefully you've got in your terms and conditions something about the fact they've got a valid modern slavery statement as well. So you can turn to that if you don't have any other specific requirements. Okay, so I wanted to go through the cycle that I spoke of before in terms of integrating responsible procurement into each and every stage of the procurement process, obviously focus. So as I said before, use of current relationships and current data is really important. I think in procurement, I wonder if someone could put a thumb up if they can actually hear me properly, because it's coming up on my screen that my internet connection isn't ideal. Okay, amazing. So wonderful stuff. So in terms of contract review, what I was going to say was our existing contractors are a wealth of information. Sometimes in the procurement team, we think about engaging with suppliers as something that we're kind of a little bit averse to doing it. We're very used to not being able to engage with suppliers during tender processes, but it doesn't mean that we can't speak to and use our existing suppliers as a resource for bouncing ideas off them in an informal way, but also requesting information from them, even if it's not in their original contract. So measuring their current performance, asking them, what do you have in your current procurement processes? Do you have any supplier selection criteria of your own? What are your existing due diligence processes? To try and get a kind of understanding of what the current performance is with them. It can also feed into subsequent market testing before you go out to tender, of where you can kind of set a baseline. What kind of level can you expect from that particular sector? But also it means that they tend to be quite receptive when you do reach out and want to talk to them about their current procedures, because at the end of the day, if you're giving them information about how to improve, it means they stand a much better chance of winning bids in future. So they do tend to be quite receptive when you reach out. Many aren't very far along their journey and can use all the help possible. I've given various briefings and workshops on modern slavery to our suppliers, and I do find that it can be quite a lonely experience, because no suppliers ever want to actually ask questions at the end. I find that with subjects like carbon, where people are a bit further down the road, you get tons of questions. But with modern slavery, you can really tell that suppliers aren't very advanced, because there's a stony silence at the end and there's not many questions. But when you speak to them on an individual level, you do get a lot of good interaction with them, lots of questions when they're not having to speak out in front of their peers. So use that resource when you've got existing contracts before you're even thinking about going to tender next time. Understand their current barriers, whether or not it be resources, whether or not it be transparency. You can advise them that they might want to affiliate with certain organizations to help them out, expert organizations, whether it be Ethical Trading Initiative or Electronics Watch or SEDEX or other organizations that might be able to help them. Okay, so moving on from contract review. Procurement strategy. So when you're thinking about how you're going to approach the market, in terms of responsible procurement, there's loads of things to think of here in terms of, breaking down contracts into smaller lots so that you can really try and push your spend through more local organizations, etc. But where it comes to modern slavery specifically, market engagement is really important. So not just with individual suppliers that are interested in your tender, but also with sectors in general. So if they have industry bodies that represent them, it's really useful to engage with them, see if they've got any best practice guides for that particular sector that you can refer suppliers to during the tender process or even before. And also engaging with subject matter experts. So people like your universities that are nearby that might be looking into this in more detail. Experts like Shiva, like Mekong Club, Stop the Traffic, etc. Make sure you use resources like the local authority scorecard. That's been super useful. I actually meant to say that at the beginning of my presentation. It was us going through the scorecard was really useful to be able to identify gaps, but also the resources that are provided within the scorecard. There's links to further resources that are really broad and quite good quality resources that you can use. So please do look at the local authority scorecard if you haven't already. So in terms of soft market testing, this is looking at specific tenders, asking questions, getting them to rank certain things in order of priority, whether or not they would be prepared to be assessed on certain things. It's a useful way of seeing where the sector's at. And with frameworks, I think a lot of colleagues in the past have kind of automatically presumed that if they're using a framework, all of the good work will have been done to start with. They don't really need to think about responsible procurement because it's from Crown Commercial Services or it's from a reputable framework provider. But there is massive differences in the quality of frameworks in terms of how recently they've been let, but also who's letting them. So one particularly good example of a construction framework, when we did a bit of a deep dive assessment into the quality of frameworks and what they were asking of suppliers when they initially set up the framework, is SCAPE. So that's SCAPE. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that framework if you haven't come across it before for construction. It's a really good practice example of what can be done, right through to actually having the framework providers going out on site and having conversations with employees in an informal basis, just making sure that what's happening on site is correct. So they're going as far as the auditing process in terms of spot checking. So do have a look at SCAPE's resources. Okay, moving on. So moving around to contractual requirements. So by this, I mean everything that the supplier must do. So as opposed to supplier selection or evaluation. So I'm referring here to both terms and conditions associated with the contract, but also looking at service specifications and scopes of works. So I think I mentioned at the very beginning that we've got a new ethical procurement policy. That was one of the things that we've asked our existing suppliers to sign up to. I'll go through this in a bit more detail in a second, but this policy relates to the actual organisation. So rather than relating to what you expect them to do as part of your contract or as part of our contract with them, it relates to how their organisation behaves as a whole. If it's a multinational organisation, then we're interested in those policies of the UK arm of the organisation. In terms of the service specification or scope of works, I mentioned at the beginning that this is probably the most robust way of being able to actually influence suppliers. If you set out very specific requirements, timescales of when they need to complete it by, it simply becomes part of the contract and it doesn't become, in their eyes or in the supplier's eyes, a kind of nice to have. So I'll take you through a particular example that we've used recently of that. Okay, so taking you through, first of all, the ethical procurement policy. I won't go into a huge amount of detail on this, but as I mentioned before, it's looking at the organisation as a whole, how the organisation operates, as opposed to how they're just treating you as part of the contract. So it's a core set of requirements, looking at what's important to Fair Westminster. So Westminster City Council was taken over by a Labour administration in May for the first time ever this year, and the tone of the organisation in terms of workers' rights, pay and conditions has obviously really ramped up under a Labour administration. So this is a brand new policy that we've developed under them. It looks at principles that we abide by as a council, and the fact that we want to cascade those principles to our suppliers. It applies to every single contract over 100k. We're not rolling it out to contracts under 100k just yet. We may do in future, but we are for now just focusing on those larger contracts, of which we have about 100 a year. And the value is anything between, or the total value is anything between 450 and 550 million per year within those 100 contracts. So we've incorporated this policy into the council's policy schedule within our terms and conditions. So it's something that suppliers have to sign up to as part of the terms and conditions of a contract. There are ways of terminating a contract if they don't abide by these. It's as many of you that are local authorities out there will know, it's not something you usually seek to do. As a local authority, you seek to kind of work on improving, escalating, encouraging contractors to kind of align with what you're asking them to do before termination. But in theory, it is possible to terminate a contract if they don't abide by this policy, but it would be very much a last resort. So in terms of the actual requirements built in here, I'll make these slides available to everyone after so you can look at it in more detail. But this first section here covers forced and bonded labour, and then aspects that aren't specifically related to modern slavery and exploitation, but are kind of similar in nature. So things like get reasonable notice periods, mechanisms for dispute resolution, grievance and appeal, whistleblowing is really key, and health and safety. The next aspects of it are very much associated with modern slavery and human trafficking and human and labour rights in general. So freedom of association and right to collective bargaining. And then looking at things like excessive hours, having an actual employment contract, and 0 hours contracts. So 0 hours can be a really complex issue, especially when you're dealing with gig economy contracts, and especially that, for example, we as a council do use a certain number of 0 hours contracts ourselves. So in terms of things like registrars, but they are always in the interest of the employee. They're at the request and behest of the employee, rather than for cost saving or risk mitigation purposes. And the last two sections here cover humane treatment, equalities and blacklisting. So this is everything from harassment and discrimination in the amongst the workforce, blacklisting of union reps or other people within the organisation who are trying to push for collective bargaining, looking at gender pay gaps, but also looking at working towards ethnicity and disability pay gaps. This isn't something that's required under law just yet, but it's something that we as a council produce in terms of data. So we'd very much like our supply chains to at least be in a position to report that data to us, if not publicly. So it's something we've got in here. And the living wage, we've had the living wage policy in place now since 2015. So that's become pretty standard practice for us. Okay, so the other aspect of what I termed as contractual requirements is within the service specification. So here's a particular example of our community equipment tender. We undertook this tender on behalf of 21 London boroughs. It's quite a complex contract. It's worth about 350 million a year. It's obviously really core to a lot of our residents, especially those in nursing, care homes, etc. So what we do first of all within the service spec is set out a definition of modern slavery, so exactly what we mean by it, and what the consortium in general, so where it refers to consortium, we're talking about those 21 boroughs who are contracting this together. So making our own commitments to modern slavery and human trafficking due diligence very clear at the outset, linking it to the legislation and why it's in there, why we have the right to put this into the service specification, and sort of explaining a bit about how it's going to work. So we have some specific milestones that I'll go on to on the next slide. But this is a particularly complex contract because we have a service provider who is responsible for coordinating all of the community equipment distribution around these 21 boroughs. But they obviously work with a number of different manufacturers. They have those relationships with manufacturers on our behalf. So they're procuring quite complex equipment in terms of, beds and, hospital type beds, right through to simple things like walking aids. But they source those on our behalf. So we need to make absolutely sure that those service providers have the correct due diligence procedures in place with the manufacturers. So I'll go through what it exactly is we've asked them to do on this next slide. So this relates to the milestones I talked about, where we set out after particular periods of time what it is we expect from the suppliers, but also we've detailed what our involvement will be in this and what involvement both the service provider and the manufacturer will have in this. So first of all, we want to see that they published a valid modern slavery statement. That's imperative. Now that now that the PPN, the modern slavery PPN, has clarified the kind of pass-fail element of a valid modern slavery statement, we wouldn't necessarily include that in future. That's very simple. So as you can see here, within 3 months of contract commencement, so after the first quarterly meeting, they've got to have provided us with a modern slavery team member or someone who is responsible for mitigating modern slavery risks within the within that organisation, so that we can have a kickoff meeting. So it's not a big ask within the first 3 months, but that particular organisation may not have anybody responsible for modern slavery. We have found that before. So if they know they're being awarded a big contract by a council, then we've given them those 3 months from contract commencement to get somebody in place. We've then asked within 5 months of contract commencement that they co-lead on the development of a system to assess the potential risks of modern slavery within supply chains of both existing manufacturers and future manufacturers that they're going to be onboarding. So as I said, it's kind of the service providers that do the due diligence on our behalf from the manufacturers. So we need that system to be set up. Then within 9 months of contract commencement and ongoing for all new manufacturers introduced, they've got to go ahead and use the system that they've developed to actually assess the potential risks of modern slavery in those supply chains. So by that, I mean looking at which are the highest risks products within that supply chain, which are the highest risks geographical locations that they're sourcing materials from, and create that kind of hotspot map of where those highest risks are. And where they do identify those risks within the supply chain, they develop action plans to mitigate those risks. So whether it be investigating further into that particular manufacturer, looking at the quality of their statement, looking at whether or not they've got any particular assessments they've already undertaken, whether or not it be something as relatively simple as MSAT, the modern slavery assessment tool put together by the government. If you're not aware of, or if you're not familiar with the MSAT, what it does, it's quite a detailed tool assessing all of the different things that you've got in place within your organization. It's quite similar actually to the local authority assessment tool that Shiva have put together, but looking at more at the business sector. So what particular things they have in place, and then it churns out a recommendations report at the end about which areas they need to work on. So that, in the absence of audit reports or factory audits, etc., is quite useful. But if they do have, so organizations like SEDEX, if you haven't come across those, are ones that have a central repository of factory audits. It's in order to create transparency, but also so that manufacturers aren't audited every 2 minutes by each and every one of their clients. They can share those audits in a transparent way so that we as clients can save the expense of auditing, but also they can have minimized disruption in terms of the number of audits that take place. Okay, so moving on now to supply selection in terms of the procurement process. So as I said, the modern slavery PPN has now been ramped up. So the requirement to produce a valid modern slavery statement can be used as pass-fail criteria within supply selection. But in terms of our own approach to supply selection, as I've said, we've developed this supplier charter, and it's used as pass-fail criteria. So it's quite robust. We have consulted this supplier charter with is over 100 suppliers during its development, and we have made some quite significant changes to it in order that we are not trying to create, or we're not having the effect of creating barriers to SMEs. So we've introduced additional elements to it and changed it according to that feedback. I can go through that shortly. Okay, so I just want to check my timing. 12 minutes. Yeah, I want to make sure I wrap up pretty quickly because I want to leave enough time for questions here. So I'll whiz through this a bit more quickly. Sorry, I didn't realize I'd spent so much time so far. The supplier charter is, as I said, pass-fail requirements that we include within the SQ, and they're tailored according to the nature, value, and duration of the contract. So you can access all of this information on our website. There'll be links within my presentation that will be disseminated to you afterwards. But we basically have the requirement itself, when the evidence is required by, what kind of sector it applies to, so that we can actually tailor this. All of these requirements are over over PCR thresholds, and the most important part that we've included in terms of duration, that came from SMEs, basically, to say if we're having very short contracts with you, it's not as relevant to include those requirements. So we've put durations on there as well now. So in terms of modern slavery, what we require here is obviously a valid modern slavery statement, that they have a point of contact, that if they do not have a modern slavery statement, if they turn over less than 36 million a year, that they have summarized due diligence procedures. It's very much like a mini statement so that we can see what it is they actually do. That they have a suitable procedure in place to actually assess modern slavery risk within their supply chain. That they undertake the modern slavery assessment tool if they are a higher value contract, and that they've initiated the recommendations that come out of that tool. In terms of award criteria, this isn't used much by our organisation. Where the risk is fairly low, or where there's a risk of modern slavery within a contract that is a kind of secondary characteristic of the contract. So let's say a security contract, and we're thinking about the uniforms and the textiles in those uniforms. It's less related to the subject matter of the contract in terms of those textiles, but we do still want to include it. I've included here a question that we've used in the past for, I think this was an electronics tender, but it's a yes, no, pass, fail question. It at least raises awareness, if nothing else. So it's very hard to score on a qualitative basis in supplier evaluation, which is why we avoid using them. We tend to really push the requirements within the specification, as I said in the beginning, but you can go through that at your leisure. And contract management and supplier relationship management are probably the most important parts here. So I've taken you through the supplier charter, where we have requirements that kick in after 3, 6 or 9 months, depending on how robust the criteria are and how complex they are. And we want to make sure that we have a decent relationship with our contract managers so that they are incorporating this as part of their quarterly standard contract monitoring and management procedures. So I'm just finishing up now. I'm really sorry to have overrun in terms of length, but I just wanted to show you what it is we do in terms of assessing criteria. I can provide a template to get circulated as to exactly how we do this later, but just to give you a bit of a snapshot, as you can see, we assess a number of different factors, right from organizational structure, but more importantly to how they risk assess and manage their risks, how they undertake due diligence, what policies they have, how effective the policies are in terms of whether or not they're actually addressing issues that they find in their supply chains, and training. So we speak to suppliers about what their score is. We don't have any league tables. We don't publish this anywhere. It's very much an internal working document so that we can start that conversation and identify gaps with our suppliers. This is a summary of our action plan from the modern slavery statement, but it just shows that kind of flow of work that we've been undertaking with both new and existing suppliers, but also looking into our framework contracts as well, which are really important. So that's me, and I am sorry again for overrunning. Really happy to answer questions in this last section.
Natalie, thank you so much. That was such an amazing presentation. I've just learned so much, and for really unpacking all the processes and protocols and where you engage with suppliers. I find it hugely informative, so thank you so much. We've got a few questions, and if anyone else online would like to, if it's got any questions, please pop them in now while I ask the first few to Natalie. So one question is around resources. What resource have you got for contract management? The reason they're asking is because they're really interested in your due diligence activity, and concerned or thinking about that will mean a much greater onus on good contract management with this approach.
It's super hard because we have a centralized procurement team, which means that policy, strategy, buy-in is quite easy to kind of get in our own team because we're centralized. Contract managers, we have around 450 across the organization. So it's very hard to roll out clear strategies or policies, etc. You definitely need them to be signed off at the highest level in order to get that buy-in from the contract managers. So we had these policies signed off at cabinet level. Undertaking a lot of training, and I found that a really good way of engaging with contract managers is to make the training very sector specific. If you give generic training on anything, whether it be carbon or modern slavery or social value, some of it just will not apply to the catering contract managers or the IT or the construction. So in the end, I broke it down into 8 different sectors and gave quite half-day training repeatedly to those contract managers, but very much sector specific to get their buy-in. I think the fact that I am moving over to the supplier relationship management side of procurement, there's only 5 of us, but still I think it's going to be a real opportunity for me to work a lot more closely with our contract managers that have this as part of their roles. It's not going to be easy, but I think the only way you can really go about it is work with your highest spend, highest risk contractors first. With carbon, we're working with 12. With modern slavery, we're working with 33, which is a ginormous amount. Make use of graduates on graduate training programs, make use of university internships, make use of very enthusiastic apprentices to kind of support you. There's people that do dissertations for good. I'm not sure if you've come across this, but I've had Imperial College students working with me to undertake research, etc. So make sure that you make use of resources that are not necessarily paid for, but obviously you're going to be giving them a lot of input and experience. My grad that I've had working with me on this has gained an awful lot of experience on modern slavery. She's now moved on in terms of the rotation, but if you have people that are really enthusiastic about this topic, they can be a real asset. But yeah, contract management in general is tricky. I think you have to be super clear. And the reason that we've set out in the supplier charter that certain things have to be delivered after 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, is to try and integrate them into quarterly contract management meetings. I'm anticipating that I'm going to have to support quite heavily in those initial meetings that they have with the contract managers for the first year. And then after that, hopefully the contract managers will have the confidence to roll those continuous improvement targets on themselves. But it is hard work. I will definitely recognise that.
Thanks, Natalie. And yeah, no, I echo your comments about working with university students, because it's actually great because it's a resource, but you're really helping develop them, to be future leaders. Next question we have is around, so you noting that you use the ethical procurement policy for all contracts over and above £100,000, but how can you adapt this for smaller supplier contracts?
Yes, it
touched on it a little bit. Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, it can be done. So what we've got two forms of contract, a short form and a long form. The short form contracts are designed so that SMEs aren't overly burdened with a million different requirements on them. So it's very much with responsible procurement as a whole. If my only job was modern slavery, then I would probably be pushing to get this into any contract that we do with anyone. And if I had unlimited resources, but because we're trying to strike this balance between really increasing the amount of local spend and spend with smaller organizations, we're trying to simplify procurement procedures and cut that red tape a little bit for smaller organizations. You can't do that within any one particular tender. You can't say SMEs, you don't have to worry, big organizations you do. So we just have to do it by contract value. It doesn't mean that we're not going to assess how this goes down, how this ethical procurement policy goes down. We're going to be doing a review over the next 6 months of how many people refuse to tender with us, drop out of bids because of it. Some things in there are relatively controversial. It very much depends on your business model. So we want to see how it goes, whether or not we get any particular issues with it, and before we start considering putting it into lower value contracts. But it's just one mechanism. If we had a low value contract for something that was very high risk, so say for example we only wanted to spend 60 grand on solar panels, of course we would be putting a lot more requirements within the actual spec, but we wouldn't use the ethical procurement policy in that example.
That's really helpful, thank you. And we've just got a couple of more questions, if that's okay, before finishing up. But question on how does your role fit into the structure of the procurement department, and how many resources and staff will you have?
So our leader is the Director of People Services. She then has a team of 5 senior leaders. So we're split into policy, governance and systems. So those are the people that run all of our gate processes and gather data, etc. I used to be part of that team, or I'm finishing that job today. And then there's the tendering team. And so they are quite numerous. We've got, I think in total, we have around 40-ish people in the whole of our procurement team. So we are quite a big team. And then we've got around 5 of us in the supplier relationship management team. So we're split into 3 parts, but we're centralized, totally centralized. So that's handy. So my job, you could sort of think that it runs across all three aspects of the team, but I think because my main role at the beginning was implementing all of this stuff and getting it into our core policy strategies, etc., it made more sense for me to be part of that policy team. But now that we've got that all in place, it's all signed off, we've communicated it internally and externally. Now my role has shifted into supplier relationship management so that I can gather good practice, support suppliers, and keep churning that back into my policy colleagues and keep training the tendering team. So I could really sit anywhere, arguably, but I'm pleased to be. It almost feels like evolution, even though it's a sidestep move. It's I'll be learning a lot more about how all this works in practice and gathering good practice to disseminate wider.
And huge congratulations on your new role, Natalie. Really hope you enjoy it. Yeah. And then just one last question, just because I've got a bit of an interest in that, so it's for me, but what have you identified as the biggest risks in the solar panel and clean tech supply chain? What will you be looking out for?
It's a polysilicon all the way. It's an absolute headache and a nightmare. The main issue we have is that we as a council, or other councils out there on the call, aren't going to be buying solar panels directly themselves. They're going to be using their tier 1 construction contractors or potentially even tier 2s. And there you start losing transparency as you go further down the supply chain. So we've met with our standard framework providers and our tier 1 contractors who we work with regularly, and our term contractors, to tell them exactly what we need now, what our new policies are, because they're often acting on our behalf. I think it's also really important to work with your when we're talking about construction, your employers' agents, your project managers that are doing this stuff on your behalf, because they'll be exercising the due diligence for you. So they need to know what your internal policies are. Where things have slipped through the net is because they've not gone anywhere near procurement. They've kind of procured on our behalf. So we're trying to let a lot less of that happen now. But yes, polysilicon is, there's lots of different stats out there. I've heard anything from 50% to 95% of polysilicon is produced in Xinjiang in the forced labor camps. So we've actually swapped out a supplier that was a Chinese company who we knew just literally through Googling was getting all of their polysilicon from Xinjiang, to a German company who manufactured in Germany and had much more robust due diligence processes. But sometimes it's difficult because you certainly can't boycott a country. I mean, America have. They've gone a bit further than us. Our government haven't done that, and we would be breaching World Trade Organization regs and our own kind of PCR regs if we boycotted. But there are ways and ways of selecting companies who are doing their due diligence properly. But yeah, it's probably an offline conversation of how you do that.
Thank you for sharing that though with us as well. But again, I just want to echo lots of people in the chat and the comments saying thank you so much for such an informative and detailed presentation. Everyone's really looking forward to seeing the slides, and we will send around the link to the recorded webinar as well. And just finally, I love this quote. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. Sorry I have to leave you as I have another meeting. Not as interesting, but unavoidable.
That's nice.
It's really lovely, isn't it? So we'll wrap it up shortly. Just thank you everyone for coming on, and again, Natalie, thank you so much. I so appreciate you sharing your wisdom and expertise. Our next webinar is scheduled for next Tuesday, the 2nd of May, where we'll be looking at reporting and remediation, and I hope you all have a great afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you.